I'm Maya Chen, and the day I became a millionaire started with my sister Rachel laughing at me for carefully folding 3 crumpled dollar bills. "Look at her," she whispered to our parents, loud enough for the entire law office to hear. $3, and she's acting like it's treasure. God, Maya, could you be any more pathetic? But when Mr. Walsh cleared his throat and said there was one final document that only I was authorized to open, Rachel's laughter died in her throat. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my worth, and the grandmother who raised me with stories of faraway islands and impossible dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in Walsh Associates buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in that sickly office glow that makes everyone look half dead. I sat in the stiffest chair I'd ever encountered, my back ramrod straight, not from confidence, but from the kind of tension that comes from knowing you're about to be publicly humiliated by the people who are supposed to love you most. The air smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and disappointment, with just a hint of Rachel's expensive Chanel perfume wafting over from where she sat beside our parents, already glowing with the satisfaction of someone who knows exactly how this story ends. Rachel had arrived 30 minutes early, not because she was eager or nervous, but because she wanted to make sure everyone in that waiting room saw her step out of her brand new Tesla, all gleaming white paint and silent judgment. She wore a black Armani suit that probably cost more than my rent, her dark hair pulled back in a perfect chignon that hadn't moved, despite the October wind whipping through downtown Portland. Everything about her screamed success, from her red-soled Louboutin heels to the Cartier watch that caught the light every time she gestured, which she did often, making sure everyone noticed. Our parents flanked her like bodyguards protecting royalty. Mom had chosen her navy Talbot's dress, the one she wore to funerals and other occasions, where she needed to look appropriately somber, while still maintaining her image as the wife of a successful businessman. Dad sat rigid in his charcoal suit, the same one he'd worn to every important family event for the past decade, checking his phone every 30 seconds like a man with more important places to be. Neither of them had looked at me since I'd walked in wearing my only black dress, the one I'd bought at Target 2 years ago for job interviews and kept for emergencies. This definitely qualified as an emergency. The law office of Walsh Associates occupied the 23rd floor of a downtown high-rise, all glass and steel, and the kind of understated wealth that whispers rather than shouts. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of ships and seascapes decorated walls, lined with legal tomes that probably hadn't been opened in decades. Mr. David Walsh himself sat behind a mahogany desk the size of a small island, his silver hair perfectly styled and his wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he shuffled through documents with the practiced efficiency of a man who delivered both good news and devastation to families for over 30 years. I folded my hands in my lap and tried to ignore the way my stomach churned with each page turn. Grandma Rose had been gone for exactly 2 weeks, and I still expected to hear her voice calling my name, still reached for my phone to text her about something funny I'd seen or a problem I needed her advice on. She'd raised me from the time I was 7, after my parents decided they were too busy building Chen Maritime Holdings to deal with a grieving child who asked too many questions about why Mommy didn't want to read bedtime stories anymore. Rose Martinez had been everything my parents weren't. Patient when I struggled with math homework, enthusiastic about my terrible attempts at painting, willing to listen to me practice the same piano piece 47 times until I got it right. She'd take me on long walks through Laurelhurst Park and tell me stories about her childhood in the Philippines, about the island where she grew up surrounded by crystal blue water and coconut trees that swayed in warm breezes. "Someday," she'd whisper as we sat by the pond feeding ducks, "I'll show you what real paradise looks like." I used to think she was just being romantic, the way grandmothers are when they want to make mundane Saturday afternoons feel magical. She'd describe white sand beaches and hidden lagoons, old lighthouse towers and Victorian houses with wraparound porches where you could sit and watch the sunset paint the sky in colors that didn't have names yet. "The most beautiful place on earth," she'd say, her eyes getting that faraway look that meant she was somewhere else entirely. "And someday it'll be yours to discover." Rachel thought Grandma Rose's stories were ridiculous. "She's filling Maya's head with nonsense." she'd complained to our parents during family dinners, where I sat silent and forgotten at the end of the table. Islands and adventures and all that fantasy garbage. Maya needs to learn about the real world, about business and making smart financial decisions. Even at 14, Rachel was already talking about profit margins and market expansion, impressing Dad with her natural understanding of supply chains and shipping routes. By the time I turned 18, the family dynamic was set in stone. Rachel was the heir apparent to Chen Maritime Holdings, the brilliant daughter who would carry on Dad's legacy and expand the business into new territories. I was the dreamer, the impractical one, who wanted to study marine biology instead of business administration, who spent summers working at the aquarium instead of interning at the shipping company, who still called Grandma Rose every Sunday even after I moved out of her cottage and into my tiny studio apartment in the Pearl District. Maya's just different, Mom would say when relatives asked why I wasn't more involved in the family business, and the way she said different made it clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. Different meant disappointing. Different meant not living up to the Chen family's expectations of ambition and success. Different meant being the granddaughter who inherited her grandmother's love of the ocean, but none of her grandmother's apparent business sense. Except now, sitting in that sterile law office with my hands clenched in my lap, I was starting to wonder how much I really knew about Rose Martinez's business sense. The woman who'd raised me on stories and hot chocolate and weekend trips to the coast had apparently accumulated enough wealth to warrant a formal reading of her last will and testament. The woman who'd lived in a modest 2-bedroom cottage and drove the same Honda Civic for 15 years had left behind an estate significant enough to require the services of one of Portland's most prestigious law firms. Mr. Walsh cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, the signal that the performance was about to begin. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a difficult time, and I appreciate your patience as we work through Mrs. Martinez's final wishes. His voice carried the practiced sympathy of someone who'd delivered similar speeches hundreds of times, warm enough to seem genuine, but professional enough to maintain appropriate distance. Rachel shifted in her chair, uncrossing and recrossing her legs with the fluid grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in any room. She wore confidence like another expensive accessory, and today it practically radiated from her pores. She knew what was coming. We all did. Grandma Rose had always favored her, had always praised Rachel's ambition and drive during those Sunday dinners, where she'd visit our family's Hillcrest Manor and listen to Rachel detail her latest achievements at business school. As you know, Mr. Walsh continued, opening the leather portfolio in front of him, Mrs. Martinez was very specific about how she wanted her affairs handled. She took great care to ensure that her wishes were clearly documented and legally binding. He pulled out several thick documents, their pages crisp and official-looking, the kind of papers that change lives with nothing more than signatures and stamps. The reading began with the expected formalities. Rose's cottage in Laurelhurst, with its vegetable garden and front porch swing, went to a local charity that provided transitional housing for immigrant families. Her Honda Civic, still running perfectly after all these years, was donated to a program that gave reliable transportation to single mothers trying to get back on their feet. Her books, hundreds of them in both English and Tagalog, went to the public library's multicultural collection. Small, thoughtful gifts that spoke to the kind of person she'd been, someone who understood that true generosity meant giving people exactly what they needed most. Then came the moment we'd all been waiting for. Mr. Baez. Walsh lifted a sealed envelope marked with Rose's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script I remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists and notes tucked into my lunchbox throughout elementary school. To my granddaughter, Rachel Chen, he read aloud, who has always shown remarkable drive and ambition. Rachel's smile could have powered the entire building. She straightened in her chair, ready to receive what we all knew was coming. The inheritance that would set her up for life. The reward for being the granddaughter who'd chosen practical success over impractical dreams. Mom reached over and squeezed Rachel's hand, their shared satisfaction thick enough to cut with a knife. I leave my investment portfolio, valued at approximately $423,000, along with my collection of jewelry and art pieces. Mr. Walsh's voice remained steady and professional, as he detailed the specifics of Rachel's inheritance: stock certificates and bonds, a small but impressive collection of Philippine art that Rose had acquired over the years, gold jewelry that had been passed down through 3 generations of her family. It was a substantial inheritance, the kind that could pay off student loans and provide a solid foundation for future investments. Rachel nodded graciously, as if she'd expected exactly this amount, as if she'd already calculated how she'd diversify the portfolio and maximize the returns. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered, her voice perfectly pitched to sound grateful and humble while still making sure everyone heard her. Dad smiled and nodded approvingly. This was exactly what he'd hoped for. An inheritance that rewarded Rachel's responsible approach to life and her commitment to financial success. "She earned it," he murmured to Mom, just loud enough for me to hear. She was the one who spent time with Rose talking about investments and planning for the future. Which wasn't exactly true, but I didn't correct him. Rachel had spent time with Grandma Rose, but mostly she'd talked at her, rather than with her, describing her latest business ventures, and asking for advice on stock picks and real estate opportunities. She'd treated those Sunday visits like networking events, opportunities to leverage their relationship for financial gain. But Rose had listened patiently and offered what guidance she could, never mentioning that her own investment strategies might have been more sophisticated than Rachel realized. Then Mr. Walsh turned to me, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "And to my granddaughter Maya Chen," he continued, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, something warmer but also more careful, "who has always seen beauty where others see only water." The phrasing was so distinctly Grandma Rose that my chest tightened with sudden emotion. She used to say that about my love for the ocean, my fascination with tide pools and marine ecosystems, and the way sunlight filtered through seawater in the aquarium tanks. Where other people saw fish swimming in circles, I saw complex ecosystems and intricate relationships and beauty beyond description. It was one of the few things about me that she'd always celebrated rather than gently tried to redirect toward more practical pursuits. "I leave the sum of $3, Mr. Walsh read, and I heard Rachel's sharp intake of breath followed immediately by what sounded suspiciously like a snort of laughter. $3. After 29 years of being Rose's favorite granddaughter, after countless afternoons spent listening to her stories and helping her plant tomatoes, and sitting beside her hospital bed during her final weeks, she'd left me $3. Not 3,000, not 30,000, just 3 single-dollar bills that Mr. Walsh now slid across the mahogany desk toward me with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been embarrassment on my behalf. The bills were old and soft, the kind that had been folded and unfolded countless times. George Washington's face looked up at me from each one, and for some reason I found myself thinking about all the times Rose had given me $3 to buy coffee at our favorite cafe on Hawthorne, the little place where we'd sit by the window and share a blueberry muffin while she told me about the islands where she'd grown up. $3 had been our tradition, the exact amount needed for 1 coffee and half a pastry, perfectly calculated to last us through an hour of conversation and people watching. But sitting in that law office with my family's eyes on me, those $3 felt like a slap across the face. I picked up the bills slowly, aware that everyone was watching, aware that Rachel's shoulders were shaking with barely suppressed laughter, aware that my parents were exchanging glances that clearly communicated their shared embarrassment at having raised such a disappointment. $3, Rachel whispered to Mom, her voice dripping with false concern. "Oh, Maya, I'm so sorry. That must be..." Well, I'm sure she meant it symbolically or something. But then her mask slipped just enough for me to see the cruel satisfaction underneath. "Although," she continued, folding the bills carefully, "maybe you should frame them. It might be the most money anyone ever thinks you're worth inheriting." Mom made a soft sound that might have been disapproval, but she didn't correct Rachel's cruelty. Dad was already checking his watch again, mentally calculating how much billable time he'd lost sitting through this reading for what amounted to pocket change. The whole room felt charged with their shared judgment, their confirmation that Maya Chen was exactly as unremarkable and unsuccessful as they'd always believed. I folded the $3 bills carefully, matching the creases that were already there, and slipped them into my purse. My hands weren't shaking, which surprised me. Some part of me had expected to fall apart completely, to break down crying or start defending myself, or demand an explanation for why my grandmother's final act had been to prove that everyone was right about my lack of worth. Instead, I felt strangely calm, like I was watching this happen to someone else. "Well," Dad said, standing and straightening his jacket, "I think that concludes everything. Thank you, Mr. Walsh, for handling this so professionally." He was already reaching for Mom's elbow, already guiding her toward the door, already moving on from this uncomfortable family obligation. Rachel stood too, smoothing her skirt and checking her phone. "I should get back to the office," she announced, as if her inheritance had suddenly made her even more important and busy than before. "There's a board meeting this afternoon about the new shipping contracts with Seattle." But Mr. Walsh hadn't moved from behind his desk. He was still sitting there with the leather portfolio open in front of him, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something about his stillness made me pause, made me look at him more carefully. His fingers drummed once against the desktop, then stopped. "Actually," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the sounds of chairs scraping and papers rustling as my family prepared to leave, "there's one additional document." The room went still. Rachel's hand froze halfway to her purse. Dad's grip on Mom's elbow tightened visibly. I felt my heartbeat pick up speed, though I couldn't have explained why. Mr. Walsh reached into a different section of the portfolio, one I hadn't noticed before, and pulled out a sealed envelope that was distinctly different from the others. Where the previous documents had been standard legal forms, this was personal stationery, thick, cream-colored paper, with Rose's initials embossed in the corner. My name was written across the front in her careful handwriting, but underneath it, in smaller letters, were words that made my breath catch. "For Maya's eyes only, to be opened when she is ready to see." "This," Mr. Walsh said, sliding the envelope across the desk toward me, "was Mrs. Martinez's specific instruction. Miss Chen, you're the only person authorized to open this document, and you may do so now, or take it with you, whichever you prefer." Rachel took a sharp step forward. "What kind of document? Why haven't we seen this before?" Her voice had lost its earlier satisfaction and taken on a hard edge that meant she was feeling threatened. "Is this even legal? Shouldn't we all know what's in there?" Mr. Walsh turned to her with the patient expression of someone who'd dealt with this question many times before. "Mrs. Martinez was very specific about the handling of this particular document. It was prepared separately, notarized independently, and sealed in my presence. Miss Maya Chen is the sole designated recipient." Dad moved closer to the desk, his businessman instincts clearly activated. "With all due respect, Mr. Walsh, we're talking about a family estate here. If there are additional assets or instructions that affect the family as a whole, don't we have a right to know?" "The document," Mr. Walsh replied calmly, "affects only Miss Chen." Mrs. Martinez was quite clear about that. I stared at the envelope, my heart hammering against my ribs. The paper felt warm under my fingertips, as if it had been waiting for me. Rose's handwriting seemed to shimmer in the fluorescent light, and suddenly I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when everyone else has stopped listening. Rachel was practically vibrating with frustration. "This is ridiculous. Maya, just open it. We're all family here. What could possibly be so secret that the rest of us can't hear it?" But something about the weight of the envelope in my hands, something about the way Mr. Walsh was watching me with what looked almost like anticipation, made me hesitate. This felt important in a way that went beyond family politics and inheritance disputes. This felt like Rose trying to tell me something she couldn't say while she was alive, something she'd saved for exactly this moment. "I'd like to take it with me," I said quietly, tucking the envelope carefully into my purse beside the $3 bills. "I want to read it somewhere private." Rachel's face flushed red. "You've got to be kidding me. We just sat through this entire reading, and now you're going to walk out with some mystery document? What if it affects the rest of the inheritance? What if there's something in there about the business?" "Rachel," Mom said softly, placing a warning hand on her arm. But I could see the curiosity in her eyes, too. The concern that maybe Rose had left behind some final revelation that would upset their carefully ordered world. I stood slowly, slinging my purse over my shoulder and smoothing down my dress. For the first time since walking into that law office, I felt like I had some measure of control over the situation. "Thank you, Mr. Walsh," I said, extending my hand to shake his. His grip was firm and warm, and he held my gaze for just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Mrs. Martinez was very fond of you," he said quietly. "She spoke about you often during our meetings. She wanted me to tell you that everything happens for a reason, even when the reason isn't immediately clear." Something about the way he said it made me think he knew more about the contents of that envelope than he was letting on. But before I could ask any follow-up questions, Rachel was pushing past me toward the desk. "Mr. Walsh, I really think we need to discuss the legal implications of sealed documents in estate proceedings. As the primary beneficiary, don't I have some right to know what other provisions might exist?" But I was already walking toward the door, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. Behind me, I could hear Rachel's voice rising in frustration, and Dad trying to calm her down with practical reassurances. Mom called my name once, but I didn't turn around. In the elevator, riding down from the 23rd floor toward street level, I pulled out my phone and looked at my last text conversation with Rose. It was from 3 weeks ago, just a few days before she went into the hospital for what was supposed to be a routine procedure. "Remember what I taught you about patience, Mija," the message read. "Sometimes the most valuable things come to those who know how to wait." At the time, I thought she was talking about my job search, my struggle to find work in marine biology that paid enough to cover my student loans and rent. I'd been complaining about feeling stuck, about watching Rachel achieve success after success while I sent out resume after resume to research institutions and conservation organizations that either didn't respond or sent polite rejection letters. But now, with Rose's mysterious envelope burning a hole in my purse and 3 crumpled dollar bills that had somehow become the most important money I'd ever received, I wondered if she'd been talking about something else entirely. Something bigger and more complicated and more life-changing than either of us had been ready to discuss while she was still alive, to answer my questions. The elevator opened into the marble lobby of the office building, all gleaming surfaces and the kind of hushed atmosphere that made you automatically lower your voice. I walked past the security desk and through the revolving doors into the crisp October afternoon, where Portland's autumn light filtered through clouds that looked like they were deciding whether to bring rain or sunshine. My Honda Civic, Rose's hand-me-down after she'd finally upgraded to something more reliable, sat in the parking garage looking exactly as humble and practical as it had when I'd driven it to work that morning. I sat behind the wheel for several minutes without starting the engine, just holding Rose's envelope and trying to process what had just happened. $3 and a sealed letter. That was my inheritance from the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me to love the ocean and trust my instincts and see beauty in unexpected places. It felt simultaneously like nothing at all and like everything I'd ever needed, though I couldn't have explained why. Part of me wanted to rip open the envelope right there in the parking garage to finally understand what Rose had been trying to tell me. But another part of me, the part that remembered her lessons about patience and timing, knew that this moment required more than the fluorescent lighting and concrete walls of a downtown parking structure. I started the car and drove slowly through Portland's afternoon traffic, past the food trucks and coffee shops and bookstores that made up the landscape of my everyday life. But somehow everything looked different now, as if Rose's $3 and mysterious letter had shifted the color of the world just enough to make me notice details I'd been missing. At a red light on Burnside, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked exactly the same as it had that morning when I'd gotten dressed for a funeral that had turned into something else entirely. Same dark hair that refused to hold a curl, same brown eyes that Rachel always said were too serious, same unremarkable features that had never inspired poetry or stopped traffic or made anyone look twice. But for the first time in years, when I looked at myself, I didn't automatically catalog all the ways I fell short of Rachel's polished perfection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, I found myself remembering something Rose used to say when I was younger and struggling with comparison. "Maya, millionaire, you are exactly who you're supposed to be." The world just hasn't caught up yet. The light turned green, and I drove toward home with Rose's words echoing in my memory and her envelope waiting patiently in my purse, holding secrets that would either break my heart or change my life completely. Probably both. At my studio apartment in the Pearl District, I climbed 3 flights of stairs past the smells of cooking dinner and the sounds of other people's lives. Television laugh tracks and phone conversations, and someone practicing violin with more enthusiasm than skill. My key stuck in the lock the way it always did, requiring just the right combination of pressure and patience to turn properly. Inside, my small space felt different somehow, as if Rose's envelope had brought new energy with it. The apartment wasn't much, 500 square feet of hardwood floors and tall windows that looked out over the street, but it was mine, paid for with money I earned working at the Oregon Aquarium, and supplemented with weekend catering gigs that left me smelling like salmon and champagne. I set my purse on the small kitchen counter and pulled out the $3 bills, smoothing them carefully before laying them side by side on the butcher block surface. Then I withdrew Rose's envelope, heavier than it looked, with something that felt like more than just paper inside. For several long minutes, I simply stood there looking at it, trying to imagine what Rose might have wanted to tell me that she couldn't say in front of the rest of the family. What secret had been important enough to warrant its own separate document, its own mysterious presentation? Finally, I carried the envelope to my couch, a secondhand sofa I'd found at a thrift store, and reupholstered myself in fabric the color of sea glass. I settled into the corner where I liked to read, pulling my legs up under me, and carefully broke the wax seal that held Rose's final message. Inside the envelope were 3 items: a handwritten letter on Rose's personal stationery, a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon, and a photograph I'd never seen before, showing a stunning white house with wraparound porches overlooking an expanse of blue water that seemed to stretch to the horizon. I picked up the letter first, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded the pages. Rose's handwriting, familiar as my own, filled both sides of the cream-colored paper with words that would change everything I thought I knew about my inheritance, my family, and myself. My dearest Maya, the letter began in Rose's careful script. If you are reading this, then the charade is finally over and you know exactly how little your family thinks of you. I am sorry you had to endure that humiliation, but it was necessary for what comes next. The $3 in your purse are not an insult, mi nieta. They represent the 3 secrets I have kept from everyone, including you, until this moment when you are finally ready to inherit not just my money, but my truth. I set the letter down for a moment, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Outside my apartment window, Portland's evening light was fading into dusk, painting everything in shades of gold and purple that reminded me of the sunsets Rose used to describe from her childhood. But her words on the page felt more real than anything I could see, more immediate than the traffic sounds filtering up from the street below. The first secret, her letter continued, is that I never stopped being the girl who grew up on an island surrounded by water so blue it looked like liquid sapphires. When I came to America at 19 with nothing but a suitcase and the address of a cousin in Portland, I promised myself that someday I would find my way back to the ocean. Not to the Philippines, but to my own piece of paradise where I could remember who I was before the world told me who I should become. I picked up the photograph again, studying the white Victorian house with its wraparound porches and gingerbread trim. The architecture was distinctly American, but the setting looked like something from a dream. The house sat on what appeared to be a bluff overlooking endless blue water, with tall evergreen trees framing the scene, and what looked like a lighthouse visible in the distance. At the bottom of the photo, in Rose's handwriting, were the words, Moonstone Island, 1978. The second secret, the letter went on, is that your father's shipping company has been paying me dock fees for the past 15 years without knowing it. The strategic location Rachel thinks makes Chen Maritime Holdings so profitable? It depends entirely on the private marina I built on the north side of the island. Every contract your sister celebrates, every shipping route your father brags about, exists because they have access to a deepwater harbor that I created and maintain. They think they've been paying a company called Pacific Harbor Solutions. They have no idea that Pacific Harbor Solutions is me. My hands started shaking as I read those words, and I had to set the letter down again. Rachel's inheritance, the $400,000 that had seemed so generous compared to my $3, was built on land that Rose owned. The business success that my family had always held up as proof of Rachel's superiority was actually dependent on my grandmother's hidden empire. I got up from the couch and walked to my kitchen window, looking out over the Pearl District's mix of converted warehouses and new condominiums. Somewhere out there, Rachel was probably celebrating her inheritance, maybe treating our parents to dinner at one of those expensive steakhouses downtown where they served wine that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She was probably already making plans for how to invest her windfall, how to turn Rose's gift into even greater wealth and success. But according to this letter, Rachel's entire foundation was built on something that belonged to me now. Something Rose had been planning and preparing for years, while sitting quietly at family dinners, and letting everyone assume she was just a sentimental old woman, with nothing more valuable than stories and gardens. I returned to the couch and picked up the letter again, my hand steadier now, but my mind racing with possibilities I couldn't quite process yet. The third secret, Rose wrote, is the one that will change your life if you have the courage to claim it. Moonstone Island is not just a piece of property, Maya. It is 15 acres of protected marine habitat, home to the largest colony of nesting seabirds on the Oregon coast. It has tide pools that rival anything you studied in your marine biology courses, underwater kelp forests that support dozens of species, and migration paths that bring whales so close to shore you can hear them singing from the lighthouse at the island's eastern point. I stopped breathing for a moment. Rose was describing my dream job, the kind of research opportunity I'd been chasing for years through applications to universities and marine research institutes that never seemed to have funding or positions available. She was describing exactly the kind of environment I'd written about in my graduate thesis, the kind of ecosystem I'd hoped to study someday if I ever got lucky enough to find someone willing to pay me to do the work I loved. But there's more, the letter continued, and I could almost hear Rose's voice in the words, warm and slightly amused, as if she was enjoying the surprise she'd orchestrated from beyond the grave. The island isn't just a research opportunity, mi nieta. It's a business. A very profitable business that has been generating income for 35 years, while everyone assumed I was just a retired seamstress living quietly in a cottage with too many tomato plants. I built the marina in 1985, after your grandfather died and left me with insurance money I didn't know how to invest. Everyone told me to buy stocks or put the money in certificates of deposit, safe investments that would provide modest returns. Instead, I bought an abandoned island that had been on the market for 3 years because no one could figure out what to do with it. 15 acres of rock and trees and shoreline that the previous owner's children wanted to get rid of after inheriting it from an eccentric uncle who'd used it as a hunting retreat. The marina came first, built by a construction crew who thought I was crazy for wanting deep water access on such a remote location. But I had studied the shipping patterns, Maya. I knew that Portland's growing port would eventually need alternative harboring options, especially for smaller commercial vessels and private yachts. I was right. Within 5 years, I was booking more boats than I could accommodate, and I had to expand the facilities twice. Then came the house, built to my exact specifications by craftsmen who specialized in historic restoration. 3 stories, 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and enough porch space to watch the sunrise over the water while drinking coffee and reading the morning papers that the supply boat brings twice a week. I furnished it with antiques I found at estate sales and auctions, pieces that had belonged to sea captains and lighthouse keepers, and other people who understood the pull of the ocean. I paused in my reading and looked at the brass key Rose had included in the envelope. It was old-fashioned, ornate, with a distinctive lighthouse engraved on the head. This was the key to that house, to that life, to everything Rose had built while I was growing up, thinking she was just my sweet grandmother who made the best adobo in Portland and never missed one of my school concerts. The financial records are in a safety deposit box at Pacific Northwest Bank, the letter continued. Box number 847. The key you're holding opens both the box and the front door of the house. The current value of the property, according to the most recent appraisal, is $8.2 million. The marina business generates approximately $400,000 annually in docking fees, seasonal rentals, and maintenance services. The conservation easement I established protects the island's ecosystem in perpetuity, while providing tax benefits that offset most of the property taxes. $8.2 million. I read those numbers 3 times before they started to feel real. Rose hadn't just left me a house on an island. She'd left me a fortune, a business, and a research facility, all rolled into one incredible gift that I was still struggling to believe actually existed. But Maya, the letter went on, and here Rose's handwriting became slightly less steady, as if she was tired or emotional. This inheritance comes with conditions that your family would never understand. You cannot tell them about the island until you decide what you want to do with it. You cannot use it to help them or bail them out or prove that you're worthy of their respect. This is yours alone, free and clear, but only if you promise me that you will choose yourself first for once in your life. I had been so absorbed in reading that I hadn't noticed how dark it had gotten outside. My apartment was lit only by the lamp beside the couch, casting long shadows across the walls and making Rose's words seem to glow on the page. I got up and turned on more lights, suddenly needing to see everything clearly, to ground myself in the familiar reality of my small space, while my mind tried to process the magnitude of what I'd just learned. Your father and sister believe they are entitled to success because they work hard and make smart decisions, Rose wrote. They have never understood that the biggest opportunities come disguised as impossible dreams. They laughed at my stories about islands and lighthouses because they could not imagine that someone like me, an immigrant seamstress with an 8th-grade education, could turn fantasies into profitable reality. Let them keep laughing, Maya. Let them keep underestimating what happens when dreamers refuse to stop dreaming. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up the $3 bills I'd left on the counter. They looked exactly the same as they had an hour ago, but now they felt different in my hands. They weren't the pathetic consolation prize I'd thought they were. They were Rose's way of reminding me that the most valuable things often come in the smallest, most unexpected packages. $3. 3 secrets. 3 decades of building something extraordinary while everyone assumed she was doing nothing important at all. The letter concluded with practical details that made everything feel suddenly, impossibly real. The boat that serviced the island was called the Moonrise, captained by a man named Pete Sullivan who had been working with Rose for over 20 years. He docked at Columbia River Marina and made supply runs to the island every Tuesday and Friday, weather permitting. If I wanted to see my inheritance, all I had to do was call the number Rose had written at the bottom of the page and arrange passage for the next available trip. But first, she wrote in a postscript that took up the entire back page of the letter. You need to understand what your family does not know about the island's importance to their business. Rachel thinks she is so smart, so strategic, but she has never bothered to read the fine print on her shipping contracts. The dock access fees that make up nearly 30% of Chen Maritime's annual profit? Those contracts are up for renewal in 6 months. And Maya, mi nieta, you now own the marina they depend on. You control their future, whether they know it or not. I sat back against the couch cushions, my mind reeling. Rachel's inheritance wasn't just smaller than mine. It was completely dependent on mine. The success she'd been so proud of, the business acumen that had made her dad's favorite and mom's golden child, was built on Rose's property that now belonged to me. And in 6 months, when those contracts came up for renewal, I would have the power to make decisions that could change everything about my family's financial future. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted. Rachel, who had spent years telling me I was too impractical and dreamy to succeed in the real world, was about to discover that her real-world success depended entirely on the dreamer she'd always dismissed. The family business that I had never been considered smart enough to join was actually impossible without my cooperation. I folded Rose's letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope along with a photograph and the key. Then I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the small suitcase I kept under my bed for weekend trips to the coast. I didn't know exactly what I was packing for, but I knew I needed to see the island for myself before I could figure out what to do with the incredible gift Rose had left me. As I folded clothes and gathered toiletries, my phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel. Hope you're not too embarrassed about the will reading, it said. Mom and I were talking about maybe setting up a small investment account for you with part of my inheritance. Help you learn about financial planning. Let me know if you're interested. The condescension in those words would have stung yesterday. The assumption that I needed Rachel's charity, her guidance, Her generous offer to let me participate in managing money that was apparently dependent on property I now owned would have made me question everything about my own competence and worth. But tonight, with Rose's letter fresh in my memory and a brass key that opened an $8 million secret in my possession, Rachel's text just made me smile. I typed back a simple response, "Thanks, but I think I'll figure out my own financial planning." Then I turned off my phone and continued packing for a trip that would either confirm that I was living in an elaborate fantasy or change the entire trajectory of my life. The next morning, I called the number Rose had given me for Pete Sullivan. His voice was gravelly and warm, with the slight accent of someone who'd spent decades talking over boat engines and ocean wind. "Maya Chen," he said when I introduced myself, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Rose told me you'd be calling eventually. She said you'd probably need a few days to process everything before you were ready to see the island." "You knew about all of this?" I asked, still struggling to believe that Rose had orchestrated such an elaborate plan without anyone in the family suspecting anything. "Kid, I've been taking Rose out to that island twice a week for 23 years. I watched her build that marina from nothing, helped her interview contractors for the house, delivered furniture and supplies and mail. She used to say that someday her granddaughter was going to inherit the most beautiful place on earth, but only when she was ready to appreciate what real beauty looks like." Pete's boat was a sturdy-looking charter vessel called the Moonrise, painted white with blue trim and equipped with everything needed for the 2-hour journey to Moonstone Island. As we pulled away from the Columbia River Marina, Portland's skyline shrinking behind us, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. Peace, maybe, or possibility, or just the simple pleasure of being on the water without having to explain to anyone why I preferred the sound of waves to the noise of traffic and conversation. Pete was the kind of captain who understood that some passengers wanted to talk and others needed quiet, and he seemed to sense that I fell into the latter category. He pointed out landmarks as we made our way toward the coast, islands and lighthouses and stretches of shoreline that looked wild and untouched, despite being only hours from the city. But mostly he let me stand at the bow and watch the water change color, from the muddy brown of the Columbia River to the deep green blue of the open ocean. "There she is," Pete called out as we rounded a rocky point, and suddenly Moonstone Island spread out before us like something from Rose's most elaborate stories. 15 acres of forested land rising from the water, with the white Victorian house perched on the highest point like a crown jewel. The lighthouse Rose had mentioned stood at the island's eastern tip, its red roof bright against the evergreen trees. And at the north end, just visible through a gap in the forest, I could see the marina she'd described, with several boats already docked at what looked like professional-grade facilities. "She spent 30 years turning this place into paradise," Pete said as we approached the main dock. "Every time I brought her out here, she had some new project going. Expanding the marina, renovating another room in the house, planting native species to encourage the bird populations. She was always thinking 5-10 years ahead, always planning for someone who would appreciate what she was building." As we tied up at the dock, I could see why Rose had fallen in love with this place. The water was so clear, I could see fish swimming around the dock pilings. Seabirds wheeled overhead in numbers that suggested healthy populations and abundant food sources. And everywhere I looked, there were signs of Rose's careful stewardship. Native plants thriving in landscaped gardens, paths that followed the natural contours of the land, buildings that seemed to grow organically from their surroundings. The house was even more spectacular up close than it had appeared in the photograph. 3 stories of architectural perfection, with wraparound porches on every level, and windows that seemed designed to capture every possible view of the ocean. The lighthouse key Rose had given me fit perfectly in the front door lock, and as I stepped inside, I felt like I was entering a museum dedicated to the life I'd always imagined, but never dared to hope I could actually live. Every room was furnished with pieces that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread about coastal elegance. Antique furniture mixed with comfortable modern pieces, all chosen for their beauty and functionality. The walls were covered with maritime art and photographs of the island taken over the decades, documenting Rose's transformation of the property from abandoned hunting retreat to world-class private estate. But it was the library that took my breath away completely. An entire room lined floor to ceiling with books about marine biology, oceanography, conservation, and environmental science. Journals and research papers organized by subject and date. Maps of ocean currents and migration patterns. And at the center of it all, a desk equipped with high-end computer equipment and research tools that would have been the envy of any university marine biology department. On the desk was another envelope with my name on it, and inside, a letter that was shorter but no less stunning than the one I'd read the night before. "If you are reading this," Rose had written, "then you have seen what 30 years of patient planning can accomplish. This library contains everything you need to understand the island's ecosystems, its role in regional conservation efforts, and its potential as a research facility. But more importantly, Maya, it contains proof that dreams are just plans that other people don't understand yet." The letter went on to explain that Rose had been quietly funding marine research for years, providing grants to graduate students and conservation organizations that were working to protect Pacific Coast ecosystems. The island had been used as an unofficial research station, hosting visiting scientists and serving as a data collection point for studies on everything from whale migration to climate change impacts on coastal bird populations. "You have choices to make now," Rose's letter concluded. "You can sell the island and use the money to buy yourself the kind of conventional success your family would understand. You can turn it into a full-time research facility and dedicate your life to the conservation work you've always talked about. Or you can do what I did. Create something entirely new, something that serves your passions while also providing the financial independence to never again depend on anyone else's approval or support. Whatever you choose, mi nieta, choose it because it makes you happy, not because it makes anyone else proud." I spent the rest of the day exploring the island, walking the trails Rose had created, and discovering the tide pools she'd written about in her letter. Every turn revealed new wonders. A hidden cove where seals basked on the rocks, a meadow where wildflowers bloomed in colors that rivaled any garden, overlooks where you could see whales spouting in the distance, and eagles soaring overhead. By evening, as I sat on the house's main porch watching the sun set over water that really did look like liquid gold, I understood what Rose had been trying to tell me all those years, when she described paradise as something you create rather than something you find. This island wasn't just valuable because of its market price or its business potential. It was valuable because it represented the possibility of building a life that honored both dreams and practicality, both passion and profit. Pete found me there as the last light faded from the sky, holding 2 cups of coffee and settling into the rocking chair beside mine. "She used to sit right there every evening," he said, nodding toward the chair I'd chosen. "Said it was the best place on earth to think about what really mattered." "How long did she know?" I asked. "About the family? About how they treated me?" Pete was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the water. "Rose was a lot smarter than people gave her credit for," he finally said. "She saw everything, understood everything. She just chose to wait until the right moment to act on what she knew. That's island time for you. Everything happens when it's supposed to happen, not a minute sooner." That night, sleeping in the bedroom Rose had prepared for me with windows that looked out over the ocean and linens that smelled like lavender and sea air, I dreamed about whales singing just offshore and woke up to the sound of actual whale songs carrying across the water in the pre-dawn darkness. For the first time in my adult life, I fell asleep without worrying about money or job applications or family disapproval, and woke up feeling like I had all the time in the world to figure out what I wanted to do next. The answer, when it came to me over coffee on the porch as the sunrise painted the sky in impossible shades of pink and gold, was surprisingly simple. I wanted to do everything. I wanted to turn the island into a research station that would attract the world's best marine biologists. I wanted to expand the marina business and use the profits to fund conservation efforts throughout the Pacific Northwest. I wanted to create educational programs that would bring students and researchers to experience the kind of hands-on learning that only an island laboratory could provide. And someday, when I was ready, I wanted to have a conversation with my family about contract renewals and business partnerships and what it really meant to build something that lasted. But not yet. First, I had an island to explore, a business to learn, and 30 years worth of Rose's careful planning to understand and appreciate. As I sat there watching the world wake up around me, I pulled out my phone and found 17 missed calls from Rachel, and 12 text messages asking where I was and what I was doing, and whether I needed help processing my disappointment about the inheritance. I turned the phone off without reading the rest of the messages and slipped it back into my pocket. Rachel could wait. The whole world could wait. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, and I wasn't going to apologize for that to anyone. Rose had spent 30 years building me a foundation for the life I'd always dreamed of but never believed I deserved. The least I could do was take the time to appreciate it properly before I started sharing it with people who had never bothered to share anything meaningful with me. The call came at 6 in the morning, 3 days after I'd returned from my first trip to Moonstone Island. I was sitting in my kitchen, still half asleep, drinking coffee that tasted like instant disappointment compared to the French roast Pete had served me on the island's wraparound porch. The number on my phone screen was one I recognized but rarely answered. Chen, Maritime Holdings, Rachel's direct office line. Maya, where the hell have you been? Rachel's voice cut through the morning's silence like a blade. No greeting, no pleasantries, just the sharp edge of someone who was used to getting immediate responses to her demands. I've been calling you for 3 days. Mom's been worried sick. I took another sip of my subpar coffee and watched a delivery truck navigate the narrow street below my apartment window. Portland was waking up around me. The familiar rhythm of traffic and footsteps and doors slamming as people headed off to jobs that paid their bills and defined their worth in the world's eyes. Just days ago, I'd been one of those people, measuring my value by my productivity and my paycheck. Now I owned a private island and a business that generated more income in a year than most people saw in a decade. I went away for a few days, I said finally, my voice still rough with sleep. I needed some time to think. Think about what? Maya, you got $3. I understand you're disappointed, but disappearing like this is ridiculous. We're family. We take care of each other. The way Rachel said family made it sound like a business transaction, something with terms and conditions that I was violating by not playing my assigned role. I'm fine, Rachel. I don't need taking care of. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear Rachel recalibrating her approach. She was nothing if not strategic, always adjusting her tactics based on what she thought would get her the results she wanted. Look, I know this whole inheritance thing was awkward. Maybe Grandma Rose was confused at the end, you know? Medical issues can affect judgment. But I meant what I said about helping you invest some of my inheritance. We could set up a nice little portfolio for you, get you started on the right track financially. The condescension in her voice was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. Rachel genuinely believed she was being generous, offering to share her windfall with her pathetic little sister who clearly needed guidance and support. She had no idea that her windfall was entirely dependent on contracts I now controlled, or that the little portfolio she was offering to help me create wouldn't even cover the property taxes on what I'd inherited. That's really thoughtful of you, I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. But I think I'm going to figure out my own financial situation. Maya, be realistic. You work at an aquarium. You make what, $30,000 a year? You've never invested anything more complicated than a savings account. I'm trying to help you here, but you have to let me help you. And there it was, the fundamental assumption that had shaped every interaction I'd ever had with my family. I was the failure, the one who needed rescuing, the person whose dreams were too impractical and whose judgment was too poor to be trusted with anything important. Rachel couldn't imagine a scenario where I didn't need her guidance because she'd never bothered to consider that I might have capabilities or resources she didn't know about. I appreciate the offer, I said, standing up and walking to my living room window. Down on the street, a woman was walking a golden retriever who kept stopping to investigate every interesting smell, and she waited patiently each time, clearly in no hurry to get anywhere. There was something about her unhurried pace that reminded me of Rose, of the way she'd always moved through the world with quiet confidence rather than frantic urgency. But I'm going to pass. Pass? Rachel's voice went up an octave. Maya, this is your future we're talking about. Your security. You can't just pass on financial planning because you're too proud to accept help. I'm not too proud, I said. I'm just not interested. The silence that followed was loaded with Rachel's frustration and confusion. She couldn't understand why I wasn't grateful for her generous offer, why I wasn't jumping at the chance to let her manage my financial future. In her mind, she was the successful one, the one with business acumen and investment knowledge, and I was just being stubborn and foolish by refusing her expertise. Fine, she said finally, her voice cold. But when you're struggling to pay rent next year because you blew through your savings on some ridiculous impulse purchase, don't come crying to me. I tried to help you, Maya. I tried to be the responsible sister here. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my sunny living room with the phone still pressed to my ear and a smile spreading across my face that I couldn't seem to control. Rachel thought she was punishing me by withdrawing her offer of help. She had no idea she was actually giving me exactly what I wanted, the freedom to handle my inheritance without her interference or supervision. I spent the morning researching Pacific Harbor Solutions, the shell company Rose had created to manage the marina contracts. The paperwork Pete had given me included 3 decades of meticulously kept financial records, and the more I read, the more impressed I became with Rose's business acumen. She hadn't just stumbled into success. She'd systematically built a maritime services empire that operated so quietly and efficiently that her clients never questioned the arrangements. Chen Maritime Holdings was her biggest customer, but they weren't her only one. Rose had contracts with shipping companies up and down the Pacific coast, providing docking services, fuel, and maintenance for vessels that needed reliable harbor access outside of the major commercial ports. The business generated steady income year-round, with peak earnings during the summer months when recreational boaters paid premium rates for access to the island's pristine waters. But the Chen Maritime contracts were special, and not just because of their size. Rose had structured them as exclusive arrangements, guaranteeing Chen Maritime Holdings priority access to the deepwater docking facilities that made their current shipping routes possible. Without that access, Rachel's company would have to find alternative harboring arrangements that would cost significantly more and might not even be available on the timeline their customers required. The contracts were set to expire on March 15th, exactly 5 months and 2 weeks away. And according to the terms Rose had negotiated, any renewal would require approval from the current owner of Pacific Harbor Solutions, which was now me. I was deep in the contract details when my phone rang again, this time showing Mom's number. I almost didn't answer, but something about the timing made me curious about what version of family concern she'd decided to deploy. Maya, sweetheart. Mom's voice was sugary sweet, the tone she used when she wanted something but was trying to pretend she was just being caring and maternal. Rachel told me she talked to you this morning. She's worried about you, honey. We all are. I'm fine, Mom, really. Are you, though? I know the inheritance was disappointing. Maybe we should talk about it. I could come over tonight, bring some of that Thai food you like from the place on Hawthorne. The offer was so uncharacteristic that I actually laughed out loud. Mom hadn't voluntarily spent time alone with me in years, and she'd certainly never offered to bring me dinner or come to my apartment. The only time she'd ever even seen my place was when she'd helped me move in 2 years ago, and she'd spent the entire visit making suggestions about how I could maximize the space and create better storage solutions. That's really sweet, but I'm fine. Just processing everything, you know. Of course, honey. It's a lot to process. Grandma Rose was, well, she was very special to you, I know. Maybe she was trying to teach you something with that $3 inheritance. You know how she was always full of little lessons and life advice? Mom's tone suggested that whatever lesson Rose might have been trying to teach was probably about accepting your place in life and being grateful for small gestures, rather than expecting grand ones. The idea that Rose might have been teaching me anything positive or empowering clearly hadn't occurred to her. Maybe, I said non-committally. Maya, I hope you know that we love you just as much as we love Rachel. The inheritance doesn't change that. Money isn't everything, sweetheart. Easy to say when you're not the one who received $3 while your sister received nearly $500,000, I thought but didn't say out loud. Instead, I made appropriate, agreeable noises while Mom continued to explain how family was more important than financial inheritances and how I shouldn't let money come between us. The irony was staggering. My entire life, my family had made it clear that my worth was measured by my financial success, my practical achievements, my ability to contribute meaningfully to the family's business and social standing. But now that I'd apparently failed even at inheriting money properly, suddenly money wasn't supposed to matter. I should probably let you go, Mom said finally, after running out of reassurances about how money couldn't buy happiness and how I was valued for so much more than my bank account balance. But Maya, promise me you won't do anything rash. Sometimes when people are hurting, they make impulsive decisions they regret later. What kind of impulsive decisions? Oh, quitting jobs, moving somewhere new, making big purchases they can't afford. Just be smart about things, okay? Think before you act. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone and trying to figure out what had prompted that particular warning. Was the family concerned that I might do something dramatic and embarrassing in response to my $3 inheritance? Were they worried I might quit my job at the aquarium and try to become a full-time artist or move to Costa Rica to volunteer at a sea turtle rescue? If only they knew that their concerns were simultaneously completely justified and utterly irrelevant. Yes, I was absolutely going to make dramatic changes to my life. I was going to quit my job and dedicate myself to marine conservation work, and probably spend most of my time living on a private island. But I wasn't going to do it because I was having an emotional breakdown over my inheritance. I was going to do it because my inheritance had given me the freedom to finally live the life I'd always wanted. The next morning, I drove to Pacific Northwest Bank and used Rose's key to open safety deposit box 847. Inside were documents that painted an even clearer picture of the empire Rose had built, while everyone assumed she was just a sweet old lady with a green thumb and too many stories about the old country. Bank statements showing decades of steady income growth. Insurance policies that protected every aspect of the island property. Legal documents establishing the conservation easement that would prevent future development while providing significant tax benefits. And most importantly, copies of all the marina contracts, including detailed correspondence about renewal terms and fee structures. The Chen Maritime files were particularly illuminating. Rose had been gradually increasing their docking fees over the years, but so subtly that the changes probably didn't even register as significant line items in their annual budgets. She'd also negotiated automatic renewal clauses that locked in rate increases tied to inflation, ensuring that her income from their business would continue growing even if she never actively renegotiated the contracts. But the most interesting document in the entire collection was a letter from Rachel herself, written 3 years ago when she'd been promoted to head of operations at Chen Maritime Holdings. In it, she thanked Pacific Harbor Solutions for their invaluable partnership and noted how crucial their marina access was to the company's continued growth and profitability. Without the strategic harbor access you provide, Rachel had written in her characteristic corporate speak style, Chen Maritime Holdings would be unable to maintain our competitive advantage in the Pacific Northwest shipping market. Your facilities are truly the cornerstone of our operational success. The cornerstone of their operational success. Rachel had put that in writing, signed it with her own name, and sent it to the grandmother she'd always dismissed as a sentimental old woman who didn't understand modern business. The poetic justice was so perfect, it almost felt fictional. I photocopied everything and returned the originals to the safety deposit box, then drove back to my apartment with a head full of possibilities and a heart full of something I was still learning to recognize as confidence. For the first time in my adult life, I had real power over my own future, and more importantly, I had the financial resources to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. That afternoon, I called the Oregon Aquarium and requested a meeting with my supervisor. Dr. Patricia Henley had hired me 2 years ago for a position that was part education coordinator, part research assistant, and part glorified fish tank cleaner. The pay was terrible, the hours were unpredictable, and the work itself was fulfilling enough to make up for both of those drawbacks, but just barely. Maya, Dr. Henley said when I knocked on her office door the next morning. Come in. How are you holding up? I heard about your grandmother. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you, She was really special. I'm sure she was. Take all the time you need, okay? We can cover your shifts this week if you need more time to grieve. Dr. Henley was genuinely kind, one of those rare supervisors who actually cared about her employees as human beings, rather than just as sources of labor, which made what I was about to do even more difficult but also more important to do correctly. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about my position here. I'm going to need to make some changes. Changes? I took a deep breath. I'm going to be cutting back to part-time hours, probably just weekends for the next few months. I've inherited some property that I need to manage, and it's going to require a lot of my attention. Dr. Henley's eyebrows went up. Property management? Maya, I think you're brilliant at marine education, and if you're looking for career advancement, we should talk about opportunities here. Maybe there's a path to a full-time research position if that's what you're interested in. It's not that kind of property, I said carefully. It's complicated, but I'm hoping to eventually turn it into a marine research facility. Actually, I was wondering if you might be interested in consulting on the project. It would be paid work, and you'd have access to some really unique coastal ecosystems. A marine research facility? Dr. Henley leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. What kind of facility? Where? It's a private island off the Oregon coast. 15 acres of protected marine habitat with existing infrastructure for housing researchers and visitors. I'm still figuring out exactly what I want to do with it, but I think there's potential for some really meaningful conservation work. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, like I was talking about someone else's life, someone much more ambitious and successful than the Maya Chen who'd been cleaning algae off aquarium glass just last week. But they also felt true in a way that surprised me. This was what I wanted to do with Rose's gift. This was how I wanted to honor both her memory and my own dreams. Maya, that sounds incredible. And yes, I would absolutely be interested in consulting on something like that. Can you tell me more about the property? We spent the next hour discussing Moonstone Island's ecosystems, its potential as a research site, and the kind of studies that might be possible with adequate funding and the right partnerships. Dr. Henley's enthusiasm was infectious, and by the time I left her office, I had a consultant for my marine research project and a part-time job that would keep me connected to the aquarium while I figured out my next steps. I also had my first real taste of what it felt like to be taken seriously as someone with resources and plans, rather than just dreams and good intentions. Dr. Henley had listened to my ideas with the respect she'd give to any serious colleague, not the indulgent patience she might show to an employee with interesting hobbies. That evening, I was cooking dinner in my small kitchen when my phone rang with another call from Rachel. This time, her tone was completely different from the morning conversation. Maya, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Okay. Have you been in contact with anyone from Pacific Harbor Solutions? My hand tightened around the phone. Why would you ask that? Because I just got off the phone with their office manager, and she mentioned that they'd been contacted by someone asking about our contract renewal timeline. She couldn't give me any details because of privacy policies, but she said the inquiry came from someone who identified themselves as a family member of the previous owner. I set down the wooden spoon I'd been using to stir pasta sauce and walked to my living room window. Down on the street, the same woman was walking the same golden retriever, and again they were moving at their own unhurried pace, stopping whenever something caught their interest. Maya? Are you there? I'm here. Well, have you been calling them? Why would I call a marina company, Rachel? I don't know, but the timing is weird. You disappear for 3 days right after the will reading, and now someone who claims to be related to Rose Martinez is asking questions about our business contracts? It doesn't take a genius to put 2 and 2 together. The accusation in her voice was clear, but underneath it I could hear something else. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first stirrings of genuine concern that there might be more to this situation than she'd initially understood. Rachel, do you think I'm somehow connected to your shipping business? I work at an aquarium. I don't know anything about maritime contracts or harbor facilities. Then why won't you tell me where you were for 3 days? Because it's none of your business. The silence that followed was longer this time, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice had taken on a sharp edge that meant she was moving from confusion into anger. Maya, if you're playing some kind of game here, you need to stop. I don't know what you think you're doing, but Chen Maritime Holdings is serious business. We have employees and clients and financial obligations. Whatever petty revenge fantasy you're cooking up because you're mad about the inheritance, it could hurt real people. I'm not playing any games, Rachel. Then explain to me why someone claiming to be Rose's family member is suddenly interested in our marina contracts. Explain to me why you're acting so weird and secretive. Explain to me why you're turning down perfectly reasonable offers to help you get your financial life together. For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. To explain about Moonstone Island and Pacific Harbor Solutions and the fact that her entire business model was built on property I now owned. To watch her face when she realized that the dreamy, impractical sister she'd always dismissed was actually in a position to make or break her professional future. But something Rose had written in one of her letters came back to me. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people continue believing what they want to believe until they discover the truth for themselves. I'm not acting weird, I said instead. I'm just taking some time to figure things out. And I'm not interested in your financial advice because I'm perfectly capable of managing my own money. What money, Maya? You got $3. You'd be surprised what you can do with $3 if you invest it wisely. Rachel made a sound that was half laugh, half snort of derision. Maya, please, be serious. $3 isn't going to change your life, no matter how you invest it. You need to come back to reality here. Maybe reality isn't what you think it is. Oh my God, Maya, listen to yourself. You sound like one of those people who think they're going to get rich playing the lottery. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You've always been too much of a dreamer to handle money responsibly. And you've always been too sure of yourself to consider that you might not know everything. Another silence, this one crackling with tension. When Rachel spoke again, her voice was ice cold. Fine. You want to be mysterious and difficult? You want to pretend that $3 is some kind of windfall? Go ahead. But when you realize you need help, when you figure out that the real world doesn't care about your dreams and fantasies, don't expect me to be here waiting to bail you out. I won't, I said quietly. Good. And Maya? Stay away from our business. I don't know what you think you're up to, but if you interfere with Chen Maritime Holdings in any way, there will be consequences. Legal consequences. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my living room with the phone in my hand and my heart pounding from a combination of anger and something that might have been excitement. Rachel had just threatened me, which meant she was scared. Which meant she was starting to realize that there might be more to this situation than she'd initially understood. Which meant it was time for me to stop reacting to my family's moves and start making some moves of my own. That night, I called Pete Sullivan and asked him to arrange a meeting with the office manager at Pacific Harbor Solutions. It was time to formally introduce myself as the new owner of the marina that had been supporting my family's business for the past 15 years. It was time to start learning exactly how much power Rose had placed in my hands, and how I wanted to use it. And it was time to stop being the victim of my family's dismissal, and start being the architect of my own future, one business decision at a time. The attack came exactly 2 weeks later, swift and coordinated like a military operation designed to destroy everything I'd started building. I should have seen it coming, should have recognized the signs when Rachel's phone call stopped, and the family's sudden radio silence stretched on for days. But I was so focused on learning the marina business and planning the research facility that I missed the warning signals completely. I was sitting in the island's library, surrounded by Rose's marine biology books and my own research notes, when Pete burst through the front door without knocking. His weathered face was flushed from running, and he was holding his phone like it contained news that might explode if he didn't deliver it immediately. Maya, we've got problems, he said, breathing hard. Big problems. Your sister's been busy. My stomach dropped even before he explained what had happened. I'd been living in a bubble of possibility for 2 weeks, imagining that I could simply step into Rose's carefully constructed empire and begin building something beautiful on the foundation she'd created. I'd forgotten that empires built in secret don't stay secret once people start looking for them. What kind of problems? Pete set his phone on the library desk and pulled up a news article that made my blood turn to ice water. The headline read, "Local shipping company alleges fraud in grandmother's estate," and below it was a photograph of Rachel standing outside Walsh Associates, looking appropriately concerned and professional in her Navy Armani suit. Maya Chen, 29, is accused of manipulating an elderly woman's estate planning to gain control of valuable maritime property, the article began. According to Chen Maritime Holdings CEO Rachel Chen, her sister used, quote, emotional manipulation and possible forgery to convince their grandmother, Rose Martinez, 78, to transfer ownership of a profitable marina business just months before her death. I read the words 3 times before they started to feel real. Rachel had gone to the press. She'd actually called reporters and accused me of elder abuse and fraud, painting herself as the concerned family member trying to protect an old woman's legacy from a greedy granddaughter who'd taken advantage of her declining mental state. "There's more," Pete said grimly, scrolling down to show me quotes that made my hands shake with rage. "Maya has always struggled financially," Rachel had told the reporter. "She was never included in our family business because she lacks the practical skills and ethical judgment required for that level of responsibility. When our grandmother began showing signs of cognitive decline, Maya saw an opportunity to exploit the situation for her own gain." The article went on to detail Chen Maritime Holdings' discovery that their long-term marina partner was actually owned by Rose Martinez, and their shock at learning that the contracts they'd relied on for years had been transferred to someone with no maritime industry experience and a history of financial instability. "We're not just talking about a family inheritance dispute," Rachel was quoted as saying. "We're talking about potential fraud that could affect dozens of employees and business partners who depend on Chen Maritime Holdings for their livelihoods. My sister's actions could destroy a company that has served the Pacific Northwest shipping industry for over 20 years. Pete scrolled to the bottom of the article, where a small addendum noted that attempts to reach Maya Chen for comment were unsuccessful, and that legal experts suggest that elder abuse investigations in inheritance cases are becoming increasingly common as families struggle to protect vulnerable seniors from manipulation. "When did this get published?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This morning." "But Maya, it gets worse. They've already filed preliminary legal papers challenging the estate. They're claiming that Rose wasn't mentally competent when she transferred the marina property, and they're asking for a temporary restraining order that would freeze all the assets until the investigation is complete." The room seemed to tilt around me as the implications hit. If they succeeded in getting a restraining order, I wouldn't be able to access the marina income, couldn't make decisions about the business, couldn't even visit the island, without potentially facing legal consequences. Everything Rose had built, everything she'd left me, would be trapped in legal limbo, while my family destroyed my reputation and painted me as a criminal who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable old woman. Can they do that? Can they actually freeze everything based on accusations? Pete's expression was grim. With the right lawyer and enough media pressure, yeah, they can at least try. And even if they don't succeed permanently, the legal process could take years. Years of fighting, years of legal bills, years of having every decision questioned and every transaction scrutinized. I walked to the library windows and stared out at the ocean, trying to process what was happening. The water was gray-green today, choppy with whitecaps that matched my mood perfectly. Just 2 weeks ago, I'd been standing on this same spot feeling like I'd finally found my place in the world. Now I felt like I was drowning in a storm I hadn't seen coming. "There's something else," Pete said quietly. "The marina office got a call this morning from Chen Maritime Holdings. They're demanding immediate contract renegotiation meetings, claiming that any agreements made with Rose Martinez are now void due to, quote, fraudulent circumstances. They want new terms, lower rates, and guarantees that they won't face any disruption to their operations while the legal situation gets sorted out." The audacity was breathtaking. Rachel was simultaneously claiming that I'd manipulated Rose into giving me the marina and demanding that the marina continue serving her business on terms she found acceptable. She wanted to have it both ways, paint me as an untrustworthy fraud while also ensuring that her company's bottom line wasn't affected by the chaos she was creating. What did the marina office tell them? They said they couldn't make any decisions without authorization from the current owner, which is you. But Maya, they're scared. The staff depends on their jobs, and if this legal fight drags on, there might not be a business left to run by the time it's resolved. I turned away from the window and looked around the library that Rose had created for me. Every book, every piece of equipment, every carefully chosen detail was evidence of her love and faith in my future. She'd spent 30 years building something extraordinary, and now my family was trying to destroy it all, because they couldn't accept that she'd chosen me over them. But as I looked at Rose's collection of research journals and conservation reports, something clicked into place. Rose hadn't just left me a business and a beautiful island. She'd left me documentation. 30 years of meticulous record-keeping, detailed correspondence, and legal paperwork that proved exactly who she was and how she'd built her empire. Pete, I need you to help me with something. I need copies of every contract Rose ever signed, every piece of correspondence she had with clients, every financial record that shows how she built this business, everything that proves she was sharp and competent and making calculated business decisions right up until the day she died. Pete's weathered face brightened slightly. You thinking of fighting back? I'm thinking of burying them in so much evidence of Rose's competence that their fraud claims fall apart completely. But first, I need to understand exactly what they're planning to do next. The answer came sooner than I expected. I was still on the island when my phone rang with a call from an unknown number that turned out to be a reporter from the Portland Tribune. Apparently, Rachel had given them my contact information and suggested they might want to get the other side of the story for their follow-up article. Miss Chen, I'm calling about the allegations your sister has made regarding your grandmother's estate. Would you like to comment on her claims that you manipulated an elderly woman for financial gain? The question was phrased like a trap, designed to make me sound defensive no matter how I answered. If I denied the allegations, I'd sound guilty. If I refused to comment, I'd look like I had something to hide. If I tried to explain the complex truth about Rose's business empire, I'd sound like I was making excuses. My grandmother was one of the sharpest, most capable people I've ever known, I said carefully. Anyone who spent time with her understood that she was fully in control of her decisions right up until the end of her life. But your sister says that Mrs. Martinez showed signs of cognitive decline in her final months. She mentions several family members who were concerned about her mental state. Which family members? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. I can't reveal my sources, but I understand there were multiple people who noticed changes in Mrs. Martinez's behavior and decision-making abilities. Multiple people. That was interesting, considering that Rose's only regular visitors in her final months had been me, Pete, and the occasional medical appointment. If Rachel had managed to find multiple people willing to claim they'd noticed cognitive decline, it meant she'd been building this case for longer than I'd realized. Did any of these sources actually spend significant time with my grandmother in her final months? Did they have medical training or expertise in recognizing cognitive decline? The reporter paused, clearly not expecting me to ask for specifics about her source's qualifications. I can't discuss the details of my interviews, but I understand that family members were concerned enough to consider seeking guardianship proceedings. Guardianship proceedings? The words hit me like a physical blow. When? Who was considering guardianship proceedings? According to my sources, your father and sister consulted with an elder law attorney about the possibility of having Mrs. Martinez declared incompetent to manage her own affairs. This was approximately 6 months before her death, around the same time that the marina property transfers took place. My legs gave out, and I had to sit down hard on one of the library chairs. They'd tried to have Rose declared incompetent. While I was visiting her every week and watching her tend her garden and manage her correspondence with maritime clients, my family had been plotting to have her legally declared incapable of making her own decisions. Miss Chen, are you still there? I'm here, I managed to say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Would you like to comment on the guardianship consultation? Your family's attorney says they decided not to proceed with the petition because Mrs. Martinez seemed to improve, but they remained concerned about her vulnerability to manipulation. The picture was becoming clearer now, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. Rachel hadn't just decided to challenge the inheritance after the fact. She'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. The guardianship consultation was part of a strategy designed to establish that Rose was incompetent, which would make it easier to challenge any decisions she made during that time period. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that Rose was just a confused old woman making random decisions about her property. They'd never bothered to investigate the scope of her business empire or the sophistication of her financial planning. They had no idea that Rose had documentation proving her competence, correspondence showing her strategic thinking, and business records that would demonstrate her sharp judgment right up until her death. "I think this conversation is over," I told the reporter. "If you want to write a fair and accurate story about my grandmother's legacy, I suggest you do some actual research into her business acumen and the empire she built over 30 years of careful planning. But if you're just looking for quotes to support accusations that have no basis in fact, you'll have to find them somewhere else." I hung up before she could ask any more loaded questions, then immediately called the one person I knew who might be able to help me navigate this legal nightmare. Eleanor Harper answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar despite the circumstances. Eleanor had been Rose's closest friend and neighbor, a retired attorney who'd helped Rose with various legal matters over the years. More importantly, she was one of the few people who'd witnessed Rose's sharp mind and careful decision-making process firsthand. "Maya, dear, I was wondering when you'd call. I saw the news this morning, and I have to say, I'm absolutely furious about what your family is trying to do to Rose's memory. Eleanor, they're claiming she wasn't competent when she transferred the marina property. They're saying she was showing signs of cognitive decline and that I manipulated her somehow." "Cognitive decline?" Eleanor's voice was sharp with indignation. "Maya, I had coffee with your grandmother twice a week until the day she went into the hospital. She was solving crossword puzzles in pen, managing complex financial calculations in her head, and discussing current events with more insight than most people half her age. If that's cognitive decline, then I hope I decline just as gracefully. But they consulted with a lawyer about guardianship proceedings. They have some kind of documentation suggesting she wasn't capable of making her own decisions." "Did they indeed?" Eleanor's tone suggested she found this development interesting rather than concerning. "Well, that's fascinating because Rose showed me the paperwork from her own competency evaluation about 8 months ago. She was worried about exactly this kind of challenge to her estate, so she had herself evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist and a neuropsychologist. Completely clean bill of health, cognitively speaking. Full documentation of her mental acuity and decision-making capacity. I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time since Pete had shown me the newspaper article. She had herself evaluated? Oh yes. Rose was many things, but naive wasn't one of them. She knew your family well enough to anticipate that they might try exactly this kind of maneuver. She wanted to make sure there was no question about her competence when she made the final arrangements for her estate. Eleanor, would you be willing to testify about Rose's mental state? Would you be willing to go on record about her competence and her decision-making abilities? Maya, I would be delighted to set the record straight about your grandmother's remarkable mind and her very deliberate choices about her legacy. But more than that, I think I can help you build a case that will make your family's accusations look not just wrong, but malicious. What do you mean? I mean that Rose kept meticulous records of every interaction she had with your family in her final months. Every conversation, every visit, every phone call. She was documenting their behavior because she suspected they might try to challenge her estate plans. What she found was that they'd been systematically avoiding her, showing up only when they needed something, and treating her like she was already incompetent long before there was any medical reason to do so. The full scope of Rose's strategy was starting to become clear. She hadn't just built a business empire and left it to me. She'd anticipated this exact scenario and prepared for it, gathering evidence that would protect both her legacy and my inheritance from the family members who'd never appreciated her wisdom or respected her decisions. Eleanor, there's something else. The reporter I just talked to mentioned that multiple family members were willing to claim they'd noticed cognitive decline. Do you know who else might be making statements against Rose? Well, your parents, obviously. And I suspect they've managed to convince some of the staff at that fancy assisted living facility where your father wanted to move Rose last year. You remember that whole fiasco, don't you? I did remember. Dad had become convinced that Rose shouldn't be living alone in her cottage, and he'd spent months pressuring her to move into a luxury senior living facility in the West Hills. Rose had resisted, insisting that she was perfectly capable of caring for herself and that she preferred her independence. The conflict had caused a rift that lasted for months, with Dad claiming he was concerned about Rose's safety and Rose insisting that he was treating her like a child. They tried to convince people at the assisted living place that Rose needed residential care. They did more than try, dear. They actually toured facilities and spoke with administrators about Rose's supposed care needs. Your father was quite insistent that Rose was becoming confused and forgetful, despite all evidence to the contrary. I suspect there are people at those facilities who would be willing to say that he seemed genuinely concerned about her mental state. The picture was becoming even clearer now. Dad and Rachel hadn't just planned to challenge the inheritance after Rose died. They'd been building a case for her incompetence for over a year, creating a paper trail that would support their claims even though the claims themselves were completely false. But Rose had been building her own paper trail, documenting their behavior and gathering evidence of her own competence. It was like a chess match that had been playing out for months while I was completely unaware of the game. Eleanor, I need to see all of Rose's documentation. Everything she kept about the family, everything she recorded about her competence evaluations, everything that proves she was making informed decisions about her estate. Of course, dear. But Maya, you should know that this fight is going to get much worse before it gets better. Your family has clearly decided that destroying your reputation is worth the risk if it means they might get control of Rose's assets. They're going to use every weapon they have, and they're not going to be concerned about collateral damage. As if to prove Eleanor's point, my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. The message contained a link to a social media post that made my stomach clench with nausea. Someone had created a Facebook page called Justice for Rose Martinez that featured a photograph of Rose in her garden, smiling and holding a watering can. The page description read, Rose Martinez was a beloved grandmother who deserved to spend her final months in peace. Instead, she was manipulated and taken advantage of by a family member who saw dollar signs instead of a vulnerable elderly woman. This page is dedicated to seeking justice for Rose and ensuring that her true wishes are honored. The page had only been live for a few hours, but it already had dozens of likes and comments from people expressing outrage about elder abuse and offering support for poor Rose's family in their fight against a quote, 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 quote. Most of the commenters clearly didn't know Rose or our family personally, but that didn't stop them from sharing strong opinions about my character and motivations. The comments ranged from merely insulting to genuinely threatening, with several people suggesting that I should be prosecuted criminally for elder abuse. Social media, too, I told Eleanor, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the attack my family had orchestrated. They've created a whole campaign to make it look like Rose was a victim, and I was some kind of predator who took advantage of her. Maya, listen to me carefully. This is going to get very ugly, very quickly. Your family has clearly hired professionals to help them build this case, and they're using every modern tool available to destroy your credibility. You need professional help too. You need lawyers who specialize in estate litigation, and you need a public relations expert who can help you control the narrative before it spirals completely out of control. I can't afford that kind of legal team, Eleanor. Not yet, anyway. If they succeed in freezing the assets, I won't be able to pay for the kind of representation I'd need to fight them. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are. We'll have to use Rose's own documentation to expose the truth before they can bury it under a mountain of false accusations and manipulated public opinion. That night, alone in the island house that might soon be taken away from me, I sat in Rose's library and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, I'd gone from feeling like the luckiest person alive to feeling like I was fighting for my survival against people who were supposed to love me. But as I looked around at the books Rose had collected and the research equipment she'd provided, I realized that she'd given me more than just money and property. She'd given me an example of how to build something meaningful while other people were trying to tear you down. She'd shown me that the most powerful response to people who underestimate you is to exceed their expectations so completely that their assumptions become irrelevant. Tomorrow, I would start fighting back. I would gather Rose's evidence, hire the best lawyers I could find, and build a case that would not only protect my inheritance, but expose the truth about my family's behavior. I would show the world exactly who Rose Martinez really was, and exactly what she'd accomplished, while everyone assumed she was just a sweet old lady with too many stories and not enough sense. But tonight, I would mourn the family I'd always wished I had, and prepare to battle the family I actually got stuck with. Because Rose had taught me that some fights are worth having, even when the people you're fighting should have been on your side all along. The turning point came at exactly 9:47 on a rainy Thursday morning, when Eleanor Harper walked into the offices of Walsh Associates carrying a banker's box that would change everything. I was sitting beside her in the conference room, wearing my best professional dress, and trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel, while across the table, Rachel and my parents huddled with their legal team like generals planning the final assault in a war they were certain they'd already won. "Before we begin these proceedings," Eleanor announced, setting the box on the polished mahogany table with deliberate ceremony, "I believe there are some documents the court should review that might clarify Mrs. Martinez's mental state during the period in question." Rachel's lawyer, a sharp-featured woman named Victoria Stern, who charged more per hour than most people made in a week, barely looked up from her legal briefs. "Mrs. Harper, while we appreciate your desire to contribute to these proceedings, character testimony about Mrs. Martinez's general demeanor won't be sufficient to counter the medical and legal evidence we've assembled regarding her diminished capacity." Eleanor smiled, the kind of patient expression teachers reserve for students who think they're smarter than they actually are. "Oh, I'm not here to provide character testimony, Ms. Stern. I'm here to present documentation that will categorically disprove every allegation your clients have made." She opened the box and began removing files with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 40 years practicing law and knew exactly how to present evidence for maximum impact. The first folder contained Rose's competency evaluations, complete with psychological testing results and physician reports that painted a picture of a woman whose cognitive abilities were not just intact, but exceptional for her age. "As you can see," Eleanor continued, sliding copies of the medical reports across the table, "Mrs. Martinez underwent comprehensive cognitive testing 8 months before her death, specifically because she anticipated that her estate plans might be challenged. The results show cognitive function in the 95th percentile for her age group, with particular strengths in executive function, financial reasoning, and long-term planning." Rachel leaned forward to study the documents, her expression shifting from confident dismissal to careful concern. "These could be fabricated. Anyone can print official-looking medical reports." "Indeed they could," Eleanor agreed pleasantly, "which is why I've also brought the original test results from the medical practice, along with verification from both the neuropsychologist and the geriatric psychiatrist who conducted the evaluations. Dr. Maya Chen at Oregon Health Sciences University will be happy to testify about Mrs. Martinez's remarkable cognitive abilities, should that become necessary." The mention of Dr. Chen made Dad shift uncomfortably in his chair. I remembered him complaining about Rose's stubborn independence and her refusal to move into assisted living, but he'd never mentioned knowing that she'd been professionally evaluated and found completely competent. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, removing another thick folder, "Mrs. Martinez documented every interaction she had with family members during the final year of her life, because she was concerned about exactly the kind of posthumous character assassination we're witnessing today. This folder contained transcripts that made my heart ache and my blood boil simultaneously. Rose had kept detailed records of every family dinner, every phone call, every conversation, documenting not just what was said but the context and emotional undertones that revealed the speaker's true attitudes. For example," Eleanor said, selecting a page at random, "here's an entry from November 15th, documenting a conversation with Thomas Chen about his desire to have Mrs. Martinez declared incompetent so he could gain control of her finances. Quote, Tommy called again today insisting that I should let him manage my money because I'm too old to understand modern financial planning. When I mentioned that my portfolio has outperformed his shipping company's returns for the past 5 years, he became angry and suggested that I was being manipulated by my financial advisor. I reminded him that I am my own financial advisor, and he hung up on me." Dad's face had gone completely white. She was confused about that conversation. "I never suggested having her declared incompetent. I was concerned about her safety, about her living alone in that cottage." "Interesting," Eleanor replied, pulling out another document. Because Mrs. Martinez also documented her conversation with the intake coordinator at Hillside Manor Assisted Living, who mentioned that Thomas Chen had visited their facility multiple times to discuss placement options for an elderly relative with early-stage dementia. The coordinator specifically noted that Mr. Chen seemed frustrated when they explained their policy of requiring medical documentation of cognitive impairment before accepting residents. Mom made a small choking sound. Tom, you told me you were just gathering information in case she needed care in the future. I was, Dad said defensively, but his voice lacked conviction. I was being proactive about potential future needs. Proactive, Eleanor repeated, as if tasting the word. Yes, Mrs. Martinez used that exact term in her notes about your behavior. Let me read her entry from December 3rd. Tommy is being very proactive about planning my future without bothering to consult me about my present. He seems to believe that wanting to live independently in my own home is evidence of mental decline, while I see it as evidence that my mental faculties are working perfectly well. Rachel had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she leaned forward with the aggressive posture that meant she was preparing to attack. Mrs. Harper, these alleged transcripts could have been written by anyone at any time. My grandmother was elderly and possibly paranoid. Even if she did write these things, they don't prove she was competent to make major financial decisions. You're absolutely right, Eleanor agreed, surprising everyone at the table, which is why I've brought something that will settle this question definitively. She reached into the box and withdrew a sealed manila envelope that looked official enough to require its own security detail. This is a video deposition that Mrs. Martinez recorded 6 weeks before her death, specifically addressing the possibility that her mental competence might be questioned after her passing. Eleanor opened the envelope and removed a USB drive along with a notarized statement from the attorney who'd supervised the deposition. The recording was made in the presence of 3 witnesses, including a court reporter and a licensed psychiatrist. Mrs. Martinez requested that it be shown only if her competence was formally challenged in legal proceedings. Rachel's lawyer finally looked genuinely concerned. We'll need to authenticate the recording and verify the circumstances under which it was made. Of course, Eleanor said. I have signed affidavits from all 3 witnesses, along with the original time-stamped file from the legal videographer who recorded the session. But perhaps we should simply watch the deposition before deciding whether additional authentication is necessary. Mr. Walsh, who'd been sitting quietly through this legal chess match, cleared his throat and gestured toward the large monitor mounted on the conference room wall. I think that would be appropriate. Eleanor connected the USB drive to the monitor, and suddenly Rose was in the room with us, sitting in what I recognized as the island's library, wearing the blue cardigan I'd seen her in dozens of times. She looked directly into the camera with the sharp, alert expression I remembered so well, and when she began to speak, her voice was clear and strong and utterly unmistakable. My name is Rose Elena Martinez, she said, and I am recording this statement on October 8th to address allegations that may be made about my mental competence after my death. I am 78 years old, and I have been in complete control of my mental faculties throughout my adult life. I am making this recording because I believe that certain members of my family may attempt to challenge the estate plans I have made, not because those plans are unreasonable, but because they do not conform to my family's expectations about who deserves to inherit my assets. Rachel was staring at the screen with an expression I'd never seen before, something between disbelief and genuine fear. On the monitor, Rose continued with the kind of methodical precision that made it impossible to question her competence. I own and operate Pacific Harbor Solutions, a maritime services company that I built over the course of 30 years through careful planning and strategic investment. The company generates approximately $400,000 annually in revenue and owns assets valued at over $8 million. I built this business while my family assumed I was simply a retired seamstress with no understanding of modern commerce. Rose paused and looked directly into the camera with an expression that seemed to see into the future, into this exact moment when we'd all be watching her defend herself against accusations she'd anticipated months in advance. My family's assumption that I am financially naive has allowed me to observe their true characters, without the complications that arise when people know they're being evaluated. What I have observed is that my son Thomas and my granddaughter Rachel view my assets as their eventual inheritance. and they have become increasingly frustrated by my refusal to manage my affairs according to their preferences. Dad was slumped in his chair like a man who just watched his own character assassination played out in front of witnesses. Mom was staring at her hands, refusing to look at the monitor where Rose was systematically dismantling every argument they'd planned to make. I have chosen to leave the majority of my estate to my granddaughter Maya, because she has never asked me for anything except my time and attention. She has shown genuine interest in my stories, my values, and my dreams, while other family members have shown interest only in my potential utility to their own ambitions. This choice is not a punishment for my other relatives, but a reward for the person who has consistently treated me with respect and affection rather than calculated courtesy. Rose looked down at something off camera, probably notes she'd prepared for this moment, then looked back up with a slight smile that I recognized as her expression when she was about to deliver news that would surprise everyone. I should also address the specific allegation that Maya manipulated me into transferring valuable assets to her control. This allegation is factually impossible, because Maya has no knowledge of the full scope of my business activities. She believes that I live modestly on a pension and Social Security, because I have chosen not to burden her with information about my financial success. The decision to leave my maritime business to Maya was made without her input, knowledge, or manipulation, because I wanted to ensure that my choice was based entirely on my own judgment rather than on anyone else's lobbying efforts. Eleanor paused the video and looked around the table with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just won a chess match in 4 moves. Mrs. Martinez goes on for another 20 minutes, documenting specific instances of her family's behavior and explaining her business decisions in detail that demonstrates remarkable cognitive clarity and financial sophistication. She also addresses the guardianship consultation that Mr. Chen and Ms. Chen pursued, explaining that she became aware of their efforts through her own attorney and chose to gather evidence of her competence, specifically to counter any future legal challenges. Rachel finally found her voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. This doesn't change the fact that Maya has no experience running a maritime business. Even if Grandma Rose was competent when she made these decisions, that doesn't mean the decisions were wise. Maya could destroy everything Rose built through sheer incompetence. It was exactly the opening I'd been waiting for. I reached into my own briefcase and pulled out a folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment. A collection of documents that would demonstrate exactly how much I'd learned about Rose's business in the weeks since inheriting it. Actually, I said, standing up and moving to the head of the table where I could address everyone directly, I think it's time we discussed what I've done with my inheritance since receiving it. I opened the folder and removed a contract that I'd been working on with Pete and Eleanor for the past week. A document that would fundamentally change the power dynamic between my family's business and my marina. This is a new service agreement between Pacific Harbor Solutions and Chen Maritime Holdings, I announced, sliding copies across the table to Rachel and her legal team. As the current owner of the marina facilities that your company depends on, I've taken the liberty of reviewing our existing contract terms and making some adjustments that I believe better reflect the current market value of the services we provide. Rachel grabbed the contract and began reading, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she processed the numbers. These rates are triple what we're currently paying. This is extortion. Actually, these rates are exactly what comparable marina facilities charge for similar services, I replied calmly. Rose was giving you a significant family discount for 15 years. I've decided that our business relationship should reflect standard industry practices rather than family favoritism. Dad leaned over to read the contract, his face growing redder as he scanned the terms. Maya, you can't be serious. These rates would bankrupt our company. We have contracts with our clients based on our current operating costs. Then perhaps you should renegotiate your client contracts to reflect your actual operating costs, I suggested. Or find alternative marina facilities that can provide the same services at lower rates. I'm sure there are plenty of options available. Of course, there weren't plenty of options available. Rose had chosen the location for her marina specifically because it provided strategic advantages that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. The deep water access, the protected harbor, the proximity to major shipping lanes, All of these factors made Pacific Harbor Solutions uniquely valuable to Chen Maritime Holdings operations. Rachel was frantically reading through the contract terms, probably calculating how the increased costs would affect her company's profitability. "You can't do this. We have a long-term partnership with your grandmother's business. There's an expectation of continuity. There's an expectation of payment for services rendered," I corrected. "Rose honored her contracts with you because she valued family relationships over profit margins. I, however, have learned from recent experience that family relationships aren't always as valuable as I once believed them to be." Eleanor was watching this exchange with barely concealed delight, clearly enjoying the moment when the balance of power shifted so dramatically that everyone in the room could feel it. Rachel's lawyer was studying the contract with the focused attention of someone trying to find loopholes in what appeared to be an airtight legal document. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling out another set of documents, "I've been approached by several other shipping companies who are interested in securing exclusive access to our marina facilities. Apparently, our strategic location and superior services have attracted attention from your competitors." This was true, though I'd only received the inquiries after Pete had quietly let word slip to other maritime businesses that Pacific Harbor Solutions might be considering new client relationships. The interest had been immediate and substantial, with multiple companies offering terms that would more than compensate for the loss of Chen Maritime Holdings business. "Maya," Mom said quietly, speaking for the first time since Rose's video deposition had begun, "surely we can work something out. We're family. We should be able to find a solution that works for everyone." I looked at her with the same patient expression Eleanor had used earlier when dealing with people who thought they were smarter than they actually were. "Mom, 2 hours ago you were sitting in this room supporting allegations that I'm a criminal who manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman for financial gain. You were prepared to have me investigated for elder abuse and fraud. Now that you've discovered I actually have the power to affect your financial well-being, suddenly you want to work something out as family?" The silence that followed was thick with uncomfortable truth. For the first time in my adult life, I was the person in the room with the most power, and everyone was struggling to adjust to this new reality. "The irony," I continued, pulling out one final document that I'd been saving for maximum impact, "is that Rose predicted this exact scenario. She knew that once you realized the scope of what she'd built, you'd try to claim incompetence and manipulation. She also knew that once you understood my position in your business relationship, you'd suddenly discover the value of family harmony." The document I placed on the table was a handwritten letter from Rose, dated just 2 weeks before her death, that laid out her expectations for how the family would react to her estate plans. Rose writes, "Maya will be shocked by what I've left her, because she has never asked for anything more than my love and attention. Thomas and Rachel will be angry about what I haven't left them, because they have never valued anything I could give them except money and property. When they realize that Maya controls something they need, they will suddenly remember that we are family and suggest that we should all work together for the common good. This will be Maya's first real test of whether she has learned the difference between being family and being used by family." I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. Rose was right about all of it. The shock, the anger, the sudden discovery of family loyalty when it became financially convenient. But she was also right about something else. She gave me the resources to choose my own family, to decide for myself who deserves my loyalty and support. Rachel was staring at the contract terms with the expression of someone who was finally understanding the full scope of what had just happened. Her entire business empire, everything she'd built her reputation and success on, was dependent on my goodwill. The sister she'd spent years dismissing as a failure now controlled her future. "What do you want?" she asked. Finally, her voice stripped of its usual confidence and authority. "I want you to understand what Rose understood," I said. "That success isn't about taking what you think you deserve. It's about building something meaningful and sharing it with people who actually value what you've created." I gathered up my documents and stood to leave, but then paused and looked back at my family one more time. The new contract terms take effect in 30 days. You can sign them and continue our business relationship at fair market rates, or you can find alternative services elsewhere. But either way, you'll never again have the power to make me feel like I'm not good enough for this family, because I've finally learned that this family was never good enough for me. Eleanor packed up her evidence box with the satisfied efficiency of someone who'd just won the most important case of her career. As we walked toward the door, Rachel called out behind us, "Maya, wait, we need to talk about this. We need to figure out a solution that works for everyone." I turned back one final time. "Rachel, you've spent your entire adult life explaining to me why I'm not qualified to make important decisions. You've questioned my judgment, my capabilities, my understanding of the business world. You've accused me of being too impractical and dreamy to succeed in the real world. Why would you suddenly want my opinion about solutions that work for everyone?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that no one seemed prepared to answer. That evening, I sat on the wraparound porch of Rose's Victorian house, watching the sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and coral that photographers spend their entire careers trying to capture. Pete had brought me dinner from the mainland, and we ate in comfortable silence while seabirds wheeled overhead and whales spouted in the distance. "Rose would be proud," Pete said finally, raising his beer in a toast to the empty chair where she used to sit every evening. "She always said you had more strength than you knew, but that you'd need to get angry before you'd be willing to use it. I'm not angry anymore," I realized as I said it. "I'm just sad that it took this long for me to understand what she was trying to teach me." "What was she trying to teach you?" I thought about it while watching a seal surface near the marina, its whiskered face curious and unafraid. That the people who love you will love you whether you're successful or not, and the people who only love your success were never really loving you at all. My phone had been buzzing with calls and messages all evening, but I'd turned off the sound and ignored them all. Tomorrow, I would start building the marine research facility Rose had dreamed of. I would hire Dr. Henley as my chief scientist and offer research opportunities to graduate students who shared my passion for ocean conservation. I would use the marina's profits to fund scholarship programs for young people who wanted to study marine biology but couldn't afford the education. And I would send my family a wedding invitation when I married Pete Sullivan in 5 years, standing on the lighthouse point where Rose had scattered my grandfather's ashes decades ago. They would all come, of course, because by then they'd understand that staying connected to me was more important to their financial future than their pride. But that evening, as the stars began to appear over Moonstone Island and the ocean settled into its nighttime rhythm, I was content to simply sit in Rose's chair and appreciate the empire she'd built, the legacy she'd left, and the family she'd created for me through her careful planning and unconditional love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.